Okay, I'm going to get started if that's all right. I know that we've got an hour to get through lots and lots of conversation and questions and ideas about human rights and abortion today. So, welcome everyone to this webinar titled Human Rights Promoter or Pariah, the United States Record on Abortion. We're hosting this today because, as many of you will know, yesterday, December the 10th, was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which forever enshrined the rights to life, health, bodily integrity, non-discrimination, sexual and reproductive rights, and many more human rights that for most of us can sometimes take for granted. And yet, as the saying goes, human rights, we'll miss them when they're gone. Just a week after today, reproductive rights activists in the United States will mark 50 years since the passage of the Helms Amendment, which many of you will recognise as a disastrous US foreign policy that has restricted essential abortion care and decimated health networks worldwide. And of course, we're talking about human rights and abortion today in the context where Roe v. Wade has been overruled for nearly a year and a half now, and abortion bans are wreaking havoc across the US. My name is Sian Norris. I'm an investigative journalist specialising in women's reproductive rights and sexual and reproductive rights more broadly. And I'm really, really privileged to be hosting this discussion today with some absolutely fantastic speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. But before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of admin. This webinar is being recorded, and if any of you have to leave in the middle or you can't stay for the whole time, the recording will be made available after this event. We're going to open up the event to questions at the end of the discussion between me and the panelists. And if you do have a question that you want to submit, please do so using the chat or the Q&A section, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I don't think there's any more admin to do, so I'll get straight on with introducing our panel. We're joined today by Dr. Anu Kumar, who is President and CEO of IPAS, an international reproductive justice organisation that has organised this webinar and that focuses on access to contraception and abortion. Dr. Kumar is internationally recognised as an advocate for women's rights and a thought leader in global health, and has previously worked at the World Health Organization and spent 7 years at the MacArthur Foundation in their population and reproductive health programme. Also from IPAS, we're joined by Dr. Jean-Claude Mulunda, who leads IPAS's work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and he is an experienced trainer and outspoken advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and has fought for universal access to high-quality care, including access to safe and legal abortion for more than 12 years. Payal Shah is the director of the Programme on Sexual Violence in Conflict Zones at Physicians for Human Rights, and is a fellow with the International Reproductive and Sexual Health Law Programme at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. And Akila Radhakrishnan is the president of the Global Justice Centre, where she leads its work to achieve gender equality and human rights, and has taken part in groundbreaking legal work on both abortion access in conflict and the role that gender plays in genocide. She has briefed the United Nations Security Council and the United Kingdom and European Parliaments on these issues, and regularly advises governments and multilateral institutions on issues of gender equality and human rights. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. And I'm sure there are many experts in our audience who will have lots of interesting questions. But to start off, I want to open things up to all of the panel with a kind of question to get us thinking about why we're here today. So, in December the 11th, 2023, can we call the US a defender or a denier of human rights? And why? So, Payal, could we start with you, please?
Thanks so much. And maybe before I jump in, I wanted to start by really saying thank you to the co-organizers today, IPAS and Global Justice Center, for inviting me to this panel. It's really such a critical conversation, especially coming on the heels of several recent moments where the US has faced firm rebuke of its human rights record on abortion, as well as on another set on many other key issues. So, as I said, this is a complex question because the US in many ways conceives of itself as a global defender of human rights. Many Americans work side by side with global colleagues to establish the world's leading human rights treaties, many of which we will discuss today. Yet the US itself hasn't signed and ratified many of these different treaties. And even where it has signed and ratified, it often will hold reservations or state that it is not otherwise necessary for it to comply with these standards. We also see over and over again, America hold itself unaccountable to adhering to these same human rights principles that it is promoting globally, leading to a feeling of hypocrisy. In the work of my organization, we see this exceptionalism across a range of issues. I work for Physicians for Human Rights, which was founded in 1986 on the idea that health professionals have a specific role to play to stop human rights violations and to document atrocities where they're occurring. We come from the perspective of medicine and science, including forensics and public health, to really understand how laws and policies are leading to harm and to advocate against these. And what we see time and again on a breadth of issues in the US is the government failing to comply with basic international human rights standards. We've documented human rights violations occurring under the oversight of the US government on a range of issues, including excessive use of force by law enforcement agents leading to deaths in police custody, ill treatment of foreign nationals, particularly those seeking asylum, and other types of protection in the US under family separation and zero tolerance policies, as well as poor conditions in immigrant detention centers. And of course, the issue we are here to discuss today, abortion and sexual and reproductive health and rights. In the US and globally, we see over and over again how US policies lead to barriers, not just to abortion care, but more broadly inhibit women, pregnant people, and their families from being able to enjoy their full breadth of human rights. This includes both through domestic laws and policies, as well as through foreign policies that lead to family separation, perpetuate discrimination, that particularly create challenges for individuals who experience heightened forms of discrimination to have access to the care, services, and rights necessary, and also limiting funding and implementation of services as a positive right. So often human rights in the US is conceived of as what the government must not do, as opposed to what the government must proactively do. So I'll stop there and turn it over to others. I'm sure there's a lot more to say, but just to say that it's a broad concern and a broad issue to be calling for the US to be complying with these international human rights obligations.
Thank you so much. And I think that point about human rights being seen as what the government should not do rather than what they should do is really key, and something that we miss a lot of the time. We think about human rights violations as sort of almost being from this negative, but actually what can we proactively be doing as government in order to protect human rights and secure those human rights? Anu, what about you? Denier or defender of human rights?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean, and thank you to my co-panelists for being here today for this important conversation. I would argue that in many ways the U.S. has fallen down on the job of protecting human rights, particularly when it comes to abortion, for quite some time. The decision to overturn Roe meant that the U.S. joined really a handful of autocratic countries like Poland and El Salvador and Nicaragua, countries that are intent on making access to abortion practically non-existent and have very little regard for human rights. Abortion has been banned in Nicaragua since 2006 and has resulted in an epidemic of child mothers. Hundreds of girls in Nicaragua who become pregnant each year as a result of rape are forced to by law, carry out the pregnancies to term. Poland is one of only 2 European Union countries where abortion upon request is not legal. And even though abortion is legal in cases of rape, for instance, a certified letter from a public prosecutor is needed to prove that the rape occurred. In U.S. abortion rights advocates, we've been warning about this for years. We've been writing about Nicaragua. We've been testifying about this. We've been, raising the alarm for quite some time that, this can happen in the world. It is happening in the world, and it can occur here. And that's exactly what we're seeing now in a post-Dobbs United States. We saw a 10-year-old girl who became pregnant as a result of rape, who was forced to travel out of her home state of Ohio because of a trigger law banning abortion after 6 weeks, which took effect after Roe was overturned. In November, we saw a group of anti-abortion activists who filed a lawsuit in Texas asking for a court order to withdraw longstanding approval of mifepristone by the FDA. Now, mifepristone has been available for decades, and it is very safe. The research is very clear. But of course, the ultimate goal here is to remove these pills from the U.S. market, knowing that they have become an extremely important aspect of abortion access in the United States, particularly now that abortion is even more restricted legally in this country. And of course, we're watching with horror the case of the woman in Texas who, I believe just on Friday, the Texas Supreme Court put on hold the judge's ruling that approved an emergency abortion. Why is this being adjudicated? This woman is dealing with a fetus that has a fatal diagnosis. Her health is literally on the line, and she's carrying a non-viable pregnancy. And her her situation is being discussed in a court of law, not in with her doctor or not in a medical setting. It's completely insane, and it's completely like what we've seen happen in Nicaragua, in places where human rights are absolutely not respected at all. So, we know that Roe, even when it was in place, didn't guarantee access for everyone. There were people who struggled to get access even back then, but it's definitely become much, much harder for everyone. And the thing that's really quite frustrating is that we actually know as a community what needs to happen. The World Health Organization in 2022 issued a guidance, an updated guidance on safe abortion, and the framework could not be clearer. Abortion is essential health care. Abortion is a human right, and everyone who needs an abortion should be able to access it. And so I would say that right now, the United States is definitely a denier of rights.
Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, everybody who's been following this Texas case is so alarmed about the precedent that it sets and what it means. And, coming from, I'm based in the UK, so coming from a European perspective, really seeing play out what we've seen happening in Poland over particularly the last 2 years, it's a really scary time. Akila, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think Payal and Anu have really set the ground here, so it's probably not going to be surprising that I agree with them that the US isn't doing what it needs to do. And I think maybe to not repeat what they've already said, I want to pull this back up a little bit. The US has what I think is an undeserved characterization as a global leader on human rights. And I think that that's something that we really need to understand in this context, because we often group the US into a champion of human rights. And I think particularly when you look at the situation of women's rights in the United States, where not just on abortion, but things like paid maternity care, we are so far behind both human rights and what is possible in other countries, not just other global North countries, but many countries in the global South are far ahead of us using the human rights regime and thinking about what is a robust conceptualization of women's rights. And yet the Biden administration and others always go up and say the US is a champion of sexual and reproductive rights. They say we are a champion of women's rights. And I think a piece of that is, and Payal touched on the exceptionalism bit, is that we view here in the United States that human rights is for the other. Human rights is a foreign policy imperative. It's about women in Afghanistan. We don't talk about the human rights of people here in the United States. We often talk about civil rights, we talk about constitutional rights, but they're really grounded in a very uniquely American perspective. And frankly, in the context of a constitution, one that was written over 200 years ago without, let's say, a robust or a modern understanding of what the rights framework is, right? So, and I think the other piece that I'll just maybe highlight quickly is that US was such an important part of the development of the human rights system, but they've signed relatively few treaties. The few treaties that they have signed, we've failed to meaningfully domestically incorporate in any way. We put a lot of conditions when and if we ever sign a treaty, and then we just kind of use them as, at best, top-level guidance, right? There's very few opportunities to be able to vindicate the human rights regime here in US courts. Some very clever work has been done, but it's a limited framework. And I think that that's the other piece that I want to highlight, is that in addition to not seeing this as something that's here for the United States, the US isn't a promoter of the system because they're not meaningfully incorporating the system into our own, policies and positions. And, depending on the administration, I'll just end with one last point, going back to kind of SRHR. In the last administration, we also saw the Trump administration actually try to take leadership as a global regressive leader on sexual and reproductive rights. For example, they got a coalition of UN states together in what they call the Geneva Consensus Declaration to actually say that, that these states don't believe, completely contrary to any experts or grounded in anything, that abortion is a human right. And while the Biden administration very quietly withdrew from it, they've actually done nothing to assert or reframe the issue and say, actually, here in the United States, we believe that abortion, reproductive rights are fundamental human rights. And so there's this kind of, even where Democratic administrations who should be champions are taking steps, they tend not to be very assertive or vocal about what is human rights, how it applies here at home. And then you see by contrast, and I know we're going to talk about the Helms Amendment a bit later, you see how in external engagement, Republican other administrations are trying to take regressive steps to actually take leadership and define how we define these rights under international law. And so I think that those contrasts are there. And I think it certainly at this point puts the US in a position, both domestically and internationally, of being a pariah on human rights.
Thank you. And from your perspective, Jean-Claude, in the DRC, do you see defender or denier?
Thank you so much for the question. I would like to back Akila on Geneva Consensus, for example, where we saw US forcing foreign countries to sign a document that they didn't even understand the content. We followed up with the government in DRC, for example, to see if they really understand what they signed it, because what they signed was against the provision of Maputo Protocol. They also signed it, and they are currently implementing. But it was like, oh, we didn't know, we didn't read. They don't ask us to sign. So which means that not only the US ban abortion at home, but also they're trying to ban it abroad. And they use their influence. That would be a positive influence for women. Unfortunately, they use that to increase the burden on women that already have many other problems. We're living on totally different context. And the GRC context is like a complex context with war, with humanitarian setting, displaced women and things like that, where they really need comprehensive SRH services. Unfortunately, they don't not only do not allow them to have access to the services, but also they use their influence to push government to sign the document like the Geneva Consensus. So considering that aspect, I feel like US is not defender. But I would like to recognize the fact that this is the position of a small group in US, unfortunately, those that have the most influence. And they present themselves on behalf of all the people from US. But when you consider American people, they are for women's rights, they're fighting at home and abroad to make sure that women have access to all their rights, including the right for abortion. So for that, I was a bit, it was a bit complicated to decide, but I would like to recognize this work of activists from US for women's rights in the world, but also in DRC.
I think that's a really interesting and important point to make. And I think some of the votes that we've seen in the sort of month since Dobbs have proven that the American public are not necessarily with the anti-abortion decision makers on this. But Akila, I wanted to come back to you, and you touched upon it in your answer already, but we can expand on it some more. Obviously, at the Global Justice Centre, this is about achieving global gender equality through the promotion of human rights. And you've mentioned the Geneva Convention and the Geneva Consensus, and also the ways in which the US doesn't necessarily sign up to treaties. But are there other examples of how the US approach has diverged from other countries when it comes to international human rights and the consensus from experts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to focus a bit more on abortion and SRHR and really get a little bit more into how abortion is protected under the human rights framework, right? I think that the way that I often characterize it is, since the 70s and 80s, we've kind of had two different trajectories and paths. We've had this international human rights path, treaties that were written and developed in the 70s and 80s, which today have been, very robustly interpreted by human rights bodies, experts, and courts to protect access to abortion, and access to abortion as a matter of a range of fundamental rights, right? In the United States, we're often talking about this limited right to privacy in the Constitution, but internationally, it's considered as a fundamental part of the right to life, the right to health, the right to be free from non-discrimination, the right to non-discrimination, the right to be free from torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. I think what it does, the human rights framework really fully understands the centrality of reproductive rights to, the lives of those who have the capacity to get pregnant. That's why it's protected as a matter of so many fundamental rights. And that progression has consistently been one of progress. We've seen it, most recently, the Committee on the Rights of the Child actually came out with a really strong ruling as it relates to abortion, which was one of the committees that had been a bit quieter in the past. And so we're really seeing that in the United States, since the day that Roe v. Wade was decided, we've seen regression. And we've seen efforts to limit access to abortion through, a range of different methods, right? Whether it's through funding restrictions like the Hyde Amendment, and we'll talk about Helms and the global impact, but, making sure that access isn't possible. Anu really flagged the issues around the Roe framework and access already, thinking about the different ways that, layers and layers of new laws and standards were set on when abortion is considered a fundamental right. And so that regressive trend in the United States is completely counter to the international human rights trend. And it's also completely counter to how other countries have actually been developing abortion laws. Since the year 2000, 31 countries have made changes on abortion that are positive. Only 3 countries have gone backwards. And those 3 countries are the United States, Nicaragua, and Poland, right? The global trajectory is towards liberalization. And in the post-Dobbs moment, that's become incredibly clear as to where the US stands as opposed to others. So I'm just going to quickly review some of the ways that abortion access in the US has been reviewed by international human rights bodies in the last year. So shortly after the Dobbs decision in August 2022, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination called on the United States to take all necessary measures at the federal and state level to provide safe, legal, and effective access to abortion. And they actually very specifically also cited the profound disparate impact that on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of racial and ethnic minorities, because we all know that in this context, it is communities that are marginalized who are most impacted by the various types of restrictions, whether it's criminalization, whether it's financial. Building on that, in May 2023, a group of 10 UN experts known as special rapporteurs wrote to the United States regarding what they called the direct and indirect violations of international human rights law resulting from the grave and alarming deterioration in access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care, including abortion post-Dobbs. And most recently, just in November 2023, the UN Human Rights Committee called on the United States to take all necessary measures at the federal, state, and local levels to provide legal, safe, effective, and confidential access to abortion. So where does this leave us, right? So now we're building this frame where we're really understanding and situating the situation in the United States in line with their international human rights obligations. And so it's now a matter of thinking about, where do we go from here? How do we utilize what's been done at the international level domestically to create pressure, right? And that is something that we've seen as a successful strategy in a range of different states. Advocates have long utilized the international human rights system to then bring them back home to create domestic change. And I think that's really where we're at now, is to think about how in the United States, as we think about where we go from here, how do we build a framework of abortion access that's grounded in human rights, that goes beyond Roe? Because as Anu has mentioned, Roe didn't actually serve its purposes, right? The WHO has provided a framework on what that looks like. So what are the considerations that advocates and policymakers should be taking from human rights law? Abortion should be fully decriminalized. Abortion should be available on request. There should be no grounds-based, gestational, or third-party authorization of abortion. That's the future that we want to be building towards. And that's the future that the human rights frame helps us get to. So I think that the challenge here is now to think about how we break through this sense of American exceptionalism, look to other countries, look to the international system, and bring that back home.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting and so important, as you say, to think about where the US is out of step and where we've seen progress and where we're seeing regression. Anu, I wanted to come to you now, and obviously Akilah has touched upon this, but I was wondering if you could speak about how US policies and how they affect human rights, including access to abortion, particularly in the context of IPAS working globally to ensure that access.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and Akilah really did a great job of outlining the connections and the significance of abortion in various human rights agreements and treaties over the years. I want to turn our attention to a policy that's sort of plagued abortion care in low and middle income countries now for nearly 50 years. December 17th, actually, will mark the 50th anniversary of the Helms Amendment. And I want to point out, when you asked earlier about whether the US is a defender or a denier of human rights, that I think the harms of the Helms Amendment and the 50 years of denying reproductive rights, which are indeed human rights, is a case in point, is evidence of how the United States is a denier of human rights. And the Helms Amendment, we see abortion exceptionalism and American exceptionalism collide. The US is the only country that singles out an essential medical service, abortion, in its foreign aid. It stigmatizes abortion. It imposes an ideological point of view that's held by only, as Jean-Claude pointed out, a small group of people, actually, and a particularly rabid wing of a political party. And in fact, millions of Americans do not share this point of view. But the result of this policy has meant that millions of people around the world, people who live very far away from the United States, are impacted by what has been interpreted as a total ban on abortion. So the Helms Amendment, passed in 1973, states that U.S. foreign assistance funds cannot be used for, quote, the performance of abortion as a method of family planning. And that language exists not only in statute as an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, but then it is reiterated year after year in the Department of State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. So every year, the United States government actually has an opportunity to remove that language and has not done it, even under the current administration. So what that's meant is that this amendment is interpreted as a total ban on any and all abortion-related services, even in services that are provided in humanitarian settings and in conflict settings, as we're seeing in Ukraine and in the Middle East and everywhere that the United States has provided resources. So millions of people who should be able to access abortion services have not been able to because of this amendment. And it does so much more, actually, than beyond actually the actual amendment. And, I want to link it back to what Pyle said early on about affirmatively stating what is permitted, because there are actually exceptions to the Helms Amendment that are permitted, exceptions that would allow abortion care, for example, for rape or to save the life of the woman. None of those exemptions have ever been implemented. So that's just an example of how, because the US is not able to articulate a positive vision, we are stuck with an interpretation of this amendment that is extremely harmful. According to the Guttmacher Institute, there would be 19 million fewer unsafe abortions if the Helms Amendment were repealed. And there would be 17,000 fewer maternal deaths every year. And I'm quite sure that these figures are an underestimate. So we are literally, through our policies, harming and killing people around the world. So, to me, this is a clear violation of multiple human rights treaties, and as an example of how the United States is completely out of step in its foreign aid and in its domestic policy when it comes to abortion.
Thank you so much. And I think it's interesting, I reported on the Helms Amendment issue in the context of Ukraine, but also I think a lot of people in the UK and Europe are very aware of the global gag rule and the sort of ping pong that happens with every administration, but we're less familiar with the Helms Amendment, and it's really important that we keep talking about it. And that's why I wanted to hand over now to Jean-Claude and to ask you if you could give a little bit more detail about how the Helms Amendment affects people in the DRC trying to access abortion services, particularly in the context of the ongoing conflict and the displacement of people and families as a result of the conflict, and how that, you know, the Helms Amendment is inhibiting people from accessing reproductive health care.
Thank you so much. I really love the word that Anu used, saying that through policy we're harming and killing people abroad, but also at home. I think that's the reality. In DRC, for example, I think I can say the Helms Amendment have three important like influence, and the first one is the political level. You know, when US is against a right, so all the countries trying to get online. So which means that, for example, we were starting the implementation of the protocol, and then one of the questions from the government was like, okay, now the US is changing their law related to abortion. Is it still important for us to do the same, like to continue implementing Maputo Protocol or not? And of course, we lost some weeks discussing if we should continue working with Maputo Protocol to get standard guidelines or not, just because it was even not a letter. It was even not like a notification from US. No, they just followed from media what is happening there. And they feel like they should anticipate by changing by themselves and get the position of the US. This is true. And this is what's happened in many countries, especially where the US have like support through USAID or some other project. The second thing is on the health system. Many of the health systems in Africa are relying on donation. And US is one of the larger donors in Africa, especially for health. So which means that when they ban abortion in all their program, so everywhere they provide services, facilities, providers, and community can support abortion. So it's increased stigma within the health system, but also in the community. So when the organization like IPAS, with a small budget, you like try to integrate this essential care for women, everyone is like, we don't want to lose USAID money. And you're not able to cover what they're covering right now. So it's sometimes a big discussion, advocacy to be sure that they understand and they integrate those services. And this is even if we have like the Maputo Protocol, which is applicable in DRC, and the Ministry of Health have developed standard guidelines. We had, for example, a discussion on the medical management of rape. USAID is one of the donors that is supporting different development of the policies and things like that. Our role as HIPAS is to make sure that the right to access to safe and free of stigma abortion is integrated in all the policies that the Ministry of Health and the government develop when it's regarding to women's rights. And we had like discussion with the USAID partners because they said if IPAS include abortion in this policy, we no longer continue supporting this, the implementation or the final development. It was a big discussion. So which means that it's not just about what like is happening in US, it's also even about how the partners, the USAID partners on the ground understand what is said by the law, because they always focus on what is not allowed, but never on what is allowed or what is feasible. And the last thing is on the partners. Many of partners that intervene, for example, in humanitarian setting, most of them receive USAID funds, which means that they can't integrate abortion services. Last year in DRC, for example, we have through our mobile clinic provided around 2,000 abortion services to women, just in 2 camps, which means that if all the partners that are intervening in that humanitarian setting integrate in their program the possibility for women to have access to the reliable information and services, we should probably protect more than 2,000 women. As we not able to be everywhere, so it's a big problem. And another problem is that they even not allowed to facilitate like a referral for women to identify where they can receive information, where they can receive services, which is a big problem for women who are already displaced and have no one who can answer their question.
Thank you. I think that's really important. It just goes to show as well that the breadth of issues that Helms causes, it's not just about the immediate healthcare, it's about information and disenfranchising women from accessing that information. And also the sort of more philosophical issue of the US deciding on another country's behalf what their laws can and can't permit, which is, you know, a big sort of issue about who has authority and where. So Pariah, I want to come to you before we go put the discussion out to questions from the audience. But you recently wrote that cases of abuse under abortion bans in the US should be seen as torture and cruelty under international law. And I was wondering if you could expand on the arguments that you made in that article and tell us more about what international law says about abortion denial and why you think it's important we understand US abortion bans in the terms of cruelty and of torture and cruelty.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely can. So, you know, I think Anu and Jean-Claude have really acutely pointed out that these laws and policies by the US are causing really severe suffering. People are dying. People are experiencing physical and mental trauma and crises as a result of these laws here nationally and also in many contexts around the world. And within the context of much broader human rights crises, as well as conflict and humanitarian crises. And so it is really important for us to be able to shine a light on this suffering and to really bring awareness to what is happening to women and girls and pregnant people under these laws. And yet all too often for policymakers, it seems very easy to ignore these stories and to kind of brush off the harm that is caused. So one strategy globally that has been used to really shine a light on the depth of the suffering caused and the ways in which abortion bans upend profoundly individuals' lives and well-being and survival has been to utilize the international human rights protection against torture and cruel and human and degrading treatment. And international human rights mechanisms at the United Nations have been a really essential vehicle for building recognition that abortion bans are leading to torture and cruel and human degrading treatment in violation of international human rights law, and that governments need to actually respond and reform their laws and also issue reparations to women and girls who have been denied abortion under these bans. So international human rights law prohibits torture and cruel and human degrading treatment, which I'll refer to as ill treatment because otherwise it's kind of a mouthful, in several treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture, both of which are actually amongst the few treaties that the US has signed and ratified. Legally, torture is understood as the intentional infliction of severe mental or physical pain or suffering by or with the approval of state agents. Governments that are parties to these treaties, like the US, have what's called a non-derogable obligation to prevent, punish, and redress violations of the prohibition on torture and ill treatment. What that means is that there is no excuse for not fulfilling this obligation. It is never permitted to cause this kind of harm. So my organization, Physicians for Human Rights, has a long history of work on this issue and looking across a range of different forms of what constitutes torture and cruel and degrading treatment. All too often, it's considered as really about the conditions of detention or what's happening in anti-terrorism, but actually it's much broader. And our work really starts from the understanding that is in the international human rights framework, that torture includes a broad range of acts that cause severe physical or mental harm, including, in certain cases, denial of abortion. The UN bodies and experts that monitor the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment have long established that abortion bans are linked with violations of this prohibition. So for example, the Committee Against Torture, with monitors compliance with the Convention Against Torture, has recognized that the denial of abortion in certain cases can result in physical or mental suffering so severe in pain and intensity as to amount to torture. This view has been echoed by the leading UN expert on torture, the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Similarly, in 4 different cases from Ireland, Peru, and Argentina, the UN Human Rights Committee has also held governments accountable for violations of the prohibition on ill treatment. In cases where women or girls were forced to continue a pregnancy even after receiving news that their fetus would not survive pregnancy or sustain life outside of the womb, or in cases of pregnancy involving rape. So for example, in KL, in 2005, the Human Rights Committee heard the case of KL, a 17-year-old Peruvian girl who was forced to carry a pregnancy to term despite a diagnosis of anencephaly, which essentially meant that if the fetus survived through pregnancy, it would die within a few days of birth. And that's actually exactly what happened to KL. So even though the doctors had diagnosed her with this condition and noted that it was going to pose risk to her life and health and recommended a termination, state hospital authorities denied her a request for an abortion, claiming it wasn't permitted under the law. She was then forced to continue her pregnancy to term with the knowledge that her baby had no chance for survival, and then forced to breastfeed for 4 days that the baby survived. As a result, she became severely depressed and required psychiatric treatment. And the Human Rights Committee found the Peruvian government in breach of its ICCPR obligation, so that's the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, for failing to guarantee KL access to therapeutic abortion permitted by its own domestic laws and ordered reparation. It's important to note, they did not find the doctor responsible, right? This is an issue of the state and the laws, and this is a problem that must be fixed. These reparations were paid to KL in 2015. Similarly, in 2011, the Human Rights Committee heard the case of LMR, who was a woman who became pregnant as a result of rape, resulting in physical and mental suffering. She was 20 years old with intellectual disabilities and became pregnant after being raped by her uncle and sought an abortion. She actually should have been permitted an abortion under the law. It allowed abortion for rape and for women with of women with intellectual disabilities. Despite a Supreme Court order ruling authorizing the abortion, the public hospital maintained a refusal to perform the abortion, claiming that the pregnancy was too advanced. And this is really reflective of the stigma against abortion and the fear of prosecution under laws that carry high penalties. And so the Human Rights Committee held that the state's omission in ensuring LMR access to a legal abortion constituted ill treatment because it amounted to forcing her to continue a pregnancy and caused her physical pain and mental suffering. And finally, in 2 twin cases in Ireland, coming out of Ireland, 2 different women received diagnoses of fatal fetal impairments and were basically told by their physicians that under the law, they could not access an abortion in Ireland and had to travel to another country, to the UK, to be able to access care. And in that case, the Human Rights Committee once again found that by prohibiting and criminalizing abortion in situations of fatal fetal impairment, Ireland had subjected these women to conditions of intense physical and mental suffering that violated this prohibition. And it's interesting, in this case, they specifically called for law reform. They said it's not enough that the law is allowed, you can't just say the law doesn't allow this, and so it's okay for us to turn this away. You must change the law.
Yeah.
The echoes of these cases can be heard in the experiences of women and girls post-Dobbs, including in the Zarowski case, which I'm sure many of us have been following, and in our own research at PHR, where we've really seen the ways that these laws are leading to a chilling effect on access to abortion. So in Oklahoma, PHR has done research on where, during the time when Oklahoma had 4 different overlapping abortion bans, some of which have been thankfully struck down. And we conducted research utilizing a simulated patient methodology to understand pregnant individuals' ability to access information on available care and obstetric emergencies that require an abortion. And what we found is that not a single hospital in the state appeared to be able to articulate clear, consistent policies for emergency obstetric care that supported their clinicians' ability to make decisions based solely on their clinical judgment and pregnant patients' stated preference and needs. And this has led, the same week that our study was put out, there was also a news account of a woman named J.C. Stratton, who was essentially told that she would need to be on the brink of death in Oklahoma to be able to receive abortion for a partial molar pregnancy, and was told to wait in the parking lot, essentially till her health condition deteriorated.
I'm gonna cut in on that example, thank you, just so that we can stick to time. But I mean, it continues to be horrifying. I think that's the issue, isn't it? It's every single example is not just a statistic, it's not just a legal case, it's a woman, a family, a person who's been denying their fundamental human rights. And as you say, the international bodies are clear on what this means in terms of degrading and cruel and inhumane treatment. And we have to keep fighting to make sure that that is recognized. The anti-abortion movement is so keen to say that it's abortion that causes emotional harm, physical harm, but really what we are seeing is a denial of abortion causing that emotional and physical harm that devastates people's lives. So we've heard from all of our speakers, and there's been so much. My brain is like buzzing with ideas and thoughts, and I'm sorry that we couldn't have this webinar last for 2 hours, because I feel like I've had to cut in when people have been sharing such important things. I wanted to open it up now to questions from the audience, and if you could please put your questions into the chat, and then they'll be passed on to me and we can address them to the panel. But then we're just going to give you 3 minutes to come up with any questions if you haven't come up with them already. But in that 3 minutes, I was wondering, Anu, if you could talk a little bit about the positives. Is there room for optimism? This is a question I get asked about when it comes to my research and my book all the time. We've talked about the problems, the issues, the barriers, the fact that abortion bans are causing so much harm and devastation in the US and around the world. But do we have space for optimism? Is there hope for women's human rights on this issue?
I think that there is room for hope. Certainly, I wouldn't be doing this work if I thought it was completely hopeless. I think there are several pieces of evidence actually that should give us hope. One is what Akila already mentioned, that over the last 30 years, I think it's 60 countries have liberalized their abortion laws. So, the trend is absolutely in a positive direction. There's no question about it. Countries as diverse as the DRC, Ireland, Argentina, Ethiopia, Nepal, the list goes on. And it's really, really encouraging to see that progress. So there's no doubt in my mind that that we are being successful in having abortion become a legal right and a human right around the world. So I think there's cause for optimism there. And the second piece of evidence, which I'm certainly drawing inspiration from, is the fact that every single ballot initiative in the United States on abortion rights has been successful, in that the American people have defended abortion rights in every location. And that just is actually in perfect alignment with the research that IPAS did a couple of years ago that says that 9 out of 10 Americans do not support an abortion ban. So, and we're seeing that now in the ballot box. So, I guess I am optimistic that the public has finally woken up. I'm still worried. Will the all of us, but certainly Americans, we have very short attention spans. So, are we going to continue to be motivated by this issue in the upcoming elections, in the upcoming years? Because this is not just an election cycle issue. This is going to take much longer than one election cycle. And can we maintain that interest and that activism is an open question. And of course, the right-wing politicians and the anti-rights movement, they're not done yet. What they've done in terms of Dobbs is a huge victory. But what they want is a national ban. And what they want is to take away the abortion pills. And so and they want fetal personhood. So I think we need to be really clear and clear-eyed about what the end game is here and how we can mitigate that. But right now, I think there are glimmers of hope here.
Thank you. So we do have a question from Bia Gali. In Brazil, where abortion access is very restrictive, we had an excellent vote in the lawsuit to decriminalize abortion up to 12 weeks on state human rights obligations to establish a social reproductive justice system and enable access to abortion. Do you think for the US there is room to litigate to increase abortion access or abortion care using other constitutional rights? And seeing as I cut Payal off during her answer and she was speaking about those kind of universal treaties and ideas, maybe we can go to her and then maybe to Akila as well, because you have that understanding in terms of the sort of human rights frameworks that can allow challenges. So Payal, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this has actually been a key strategy in the US, has been really pushing back incrementally at the different bans that have been adopted. So for example, in Oklahoma, where I was sharing a little bit more about our work, there were 4 overlapping bans at the time that we started our documentation. And actually the reason I had to say that is because several of those bans have actually been suspended or are no longer being enforced because they were found to be unclear in legal challenges. I think there's a few different legal strategies that are underway right now nationally, some of which are really directly challenging the laws and I think will be successful in being able to strike down certain aspects of the provisions. And then there are other pieces that are also really about what I was getting at here, which is that what we have found globally is it's really important to be thinking of the courts as also a space where we can really shine a light on the full breadth of harms that are being caused by these laws. And I reflect on my own work in India and in the Philippines and Nepal and in other countries around the world where I've worked directly on legal challenges to abortion restrictions and seen the positive movement. And I do really believe the courts can be a key venue. That said, I also think we need to think about the courts not as a monolith. And one thing that gives me hope, and maybe reflecting on that question, Anna, that you just answered, is also that in addition to public opinion, there's also haven states here in the US. And it's something I think we have been thinking quite a lot about here as how do we continue to promote protection from the states where there actually is already very progressive legal, there are already progressive legal frameworks. How do we think about what's called shield laws, which allow clinicians in those states to be providing care? How do we challenge things like travel bans to allow patients to be able to access services, even on mifepristone and misoprostol and on telehealth? So there's so many different avenues. We're in a different world than we were in the 70s. And I think it's really important that we think about how we can navigate with those advancements as well.
Thank you. And picking up on that, Akila, we've had another question. How likely is it that US states will one by one decriminalize abortion? So I think this kind of overlaps those two that with the previous question, what are the routes to protecting abortion as a right, but also do you think that there's a chance that we will see decriminalization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Anu mentioned this in her remarks, right? We've seen that ballot measures have been at the state level have been incredibly popular. Every single ballot measure that's taken steps to improve access to abortion has won, and every ballot measure that has tried to decrease access to abortion has been defeated. And so I think that we are seeing states look at what are the opportunities and how do we put this up, right? And we're looking at states like Ohio where, a small group of regressive policymakers have continually tried to push for increasing abortion restrictions. And you see a ballot measure that was put to the state, to the people that said, actually, we're going to take steps forward on abortion. I think one of the questions I have, and it goes back maybe to my initial points, is how we then think about what we're asking for when we put state-based policies on the table. And I would argue that we really need to be looking towards this robust framework that's been developed under human rights. I think in a lot of states, there's still questions of, well, is 15 weeks the extreme, is it an extreme, or do we go for 20 weeks? And I think instead of spending our energy trying to decide arbitrary limits, which from a health and human rights perspective, the WHO has found to, that the only impact here is a negative impact on human rights and a negative impact on health, we should be focused on thinking about what is that full framework. So I think there's a piece in this conversation where we need to talk about what does it, when we say we want to decriminalize or we want to assert progressive policy on abortion, what does that look like so that our one goal is to actually make it as accessible as possible for individuals.
Thank you so much. And Jean-Claude, I was wondering if we could come back to you as well. I mean, one of the questions that we had for this discussion is, bearing in mind that today or yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, how important is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to protecting and promoting access to abortion, particularly for women and families in the global south?
Thank you so much. Yes, for me, the Universal Declaration is like the basic on which all the rights are built, and including the right for women including the right for access to safe abortion. So when you look at the Universal Declaration, one of the things that's come up is that it's prohibit, for example, discrimination. The fact that many governments continue like to ban abortion, pushing women to use unsafe way can be assimilated to discrimination because only women need abortion services. At the same time, it's also can be assimilated, especially when I look at the context of DRC. When women use unsafe way, what they use to get their abortion can be considered as inhuman treatment at some point. So it means for me, we celebrate just yes, but there is many things to do and even to understand, because we consider myself, I feel like there's many power word that we put on this declaration, but we really don't understand what it means. And we're not able to translate it in the real life, in daily life of everyone, including for women and young girls especially. So that's my point of view on this celebration.
Thank you. And with 1 minute to go, does anyone else want to weigh in on the UDHR and what it can mean for access to abortion?
So let me just say quickly that the UDHR is the basis of the reproductive justice framework. And so maybe my fellow panelists were going to mention that also, but this is the reason that reproductive justice framework exists and is as powerful as it is in the United States and around the world, because reproductive justice is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to have children, the right to not have children, the right to parent the children safely that we do have. It's pretty simple, but it's extremely powerful.
And maybe just quickly to add on to that, I was exactly going to say that, Anu, and also that we've really seen how the reproductive justice framework has created inspiration across the world. And just a very short, note that in South Korea, for example, the activists there that were able to get significant law reform through the courts actually really gave acknowledgement to the reproductive justice framework as the framework drawing on human rights that inspired them and really helped, create the strategic direction that allowed for change to happen. So that also gives me some hope.
And Akila, is there anything you wanted to add in the last minute?
No, I think everyone has really covered it all today. Maybe I'll just try to tie up back to our original conversation. I mean, I think that, what we've been talking about today is from a range of different perspectives, how the US can do so much better when it comes to actually, if they want to live up to their own assertion that they are a human rights champion and a champion of SRHR, there's so much to do that everyone here on this call has discussed today. And that, those are acts that lay with, responsibility that lays with everyone from the president down. And everyone has something that they can do to make the human rights picture and situation in the United States better for people with a capacity to get pregnant. So I think that the call here is we have the baseline, so let's figure out how we make that happen.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a really important call to action to end on. We know that the importance of access to safe and legal abortion, we know the difference that it makes to people's lives. And we know that we have the international human rights frameworks to allow that to happen. So the next step to do is to make sure we do that. I think it's really important, as Anu said as well, to remember that optimism. The momentum is in favor of reproductive rights and reproductive justice. The majority of law changes have been progressive and the minority have been regressive. We can do this and we have the tools with which to do it. So, let's use this opportunity to go away, strategize, think, and protect and progress women's and people's reproductive rights for the future. Thank you so much to Dr. Jean-Claude Malunda, to Anu Kumar, to Payal Shah, and to Akila Radhakrishnan for speaking with us today. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to IPAS and Global Justice Centre for organising today's webinar. It's been a real privilege to share this space with you.
Thank you, Sean. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
for participating.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.